Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a quick turnaround review of the SMSL SU-8s and SH-8s. The reason it's a quick turnaround is that these are brand new, just freshly released I think on the 10th of June, and so I wanted to get this review turned around as fast as possible to get the news out there as to whether or not I think this is a stack worth buying, or indeed individual components worth buying, because you don't have to buy them together. Before I get into it, I want to say a huge thank you to Shenzhen Audio for making the review samples available and getting them out to me before the products were released. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite get this review ready in time for the exact release date, but hopefully this is close enough for most of you. For this review, I'm going to talk through each of the individual devices on its own, and then also talk about how I find them performing as a stack. And I'm going to put them up against another stack of separates in the Geshelli J2 and Erish amplifier that you can see off to the side, and talk about which one I'd buy and in what circumstances. So come with me now as we explore the SMSL SU-8s DAC and SH-8s balanced headphone amp.
You stare into my eyes and it makes you wonder, is she the one I'll take home? I stare right back at yours and it makes me wonder, why is he here all alone? I love going out to where the music's too loud and where the people surround me. Yeah, here's my best advice, just let me stay in this vibe and never think that you owe me. Yeah, you can talk to me, boy, and you can move in up close, but that's as far as it goes. I'm not your baby, I might be your...
As a stack, the SU-8s and SH-8s retail for $590 or about 770 Australian dollars. To keep things simple though, whilst they're available as a stack and probably ideally placed as a stack, I am going to talk about them as their individual components. And I'm going to follow the source chain and start with the DAC before I talk about the amp. So let's put the SH-8s aside and talk about the SU-8s. The SU-8s here retails for $360 or about 470 Australian dollars, and that's just based directly on exchange rates from that $360 price tag. The SU-8s uses the ES9068AS chip from Sabre, and what that means is that it's got a chip in it that will decode MQA natively. Now, whether or not MQA is a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not going to get into here. There's people out there that like it, there's people out there that don't, and it's entirely up to you whether you use that feature or whether you care about that feature. The point is, it has that feature, and so I'm going to talk about it. But in addition to doing MQA, the ES9068AS chip allows the SMSL SU-8s here, lots of consonants in this review, to decode DSD up to DSD 512 and also to handle high sample rate PCM up to 768 kHz. Both DSD and MQA are also available via both Toslink and also coaxial. So there's lots of versatility and lots of capability coming from the SU-8s, and so it could be for many people everything they ever need in a DAC. Of course, I'll talk about sound quality and a comparison later on, but in terms of feature sets, decoding capabilities, the fact that it's got Bluetooth, which we'll talk about shortly, it really has everything you're likely to ever need, except perhaps for some of the more exotic, you could call them, inputs such as I2S and AES. But if you're sticking with USB, Toslink or coaxial, I really can't think of any features that the SU-8s doesn't have. Before we talk usability, let's talk a little bit about the design. You've got a nice compact casing here. There's no fancy weird kind of angles like there was in some of the old SP200 type range. So it's just a nice simple brick of a unit. On the front here, we've just got a display behind the glass panel, and we've got a controller dial that spins and also clicks in and out. So very, very simple, very, very straightforward. I'll talk about the use of the control knob in a moment. It's not my favorite interaction that I've had, but at the same time, it's also not the end of the world. Before we get there though, let's look at the back of the SU-8s. Now on the back of the SU-8s, we've got power supply. So there's an internal transformer going on here. It's a switch mode style transformer, I'm guessing, based on the size. I haven't popped this unit open, but I'm guessing based on other products I've seen in this kind of form factor that it's going to have an internal switch mode power supply taking the 240 or 110 volt input. Moving along the back panel, we've got the Bluetooth antenna here. So this is a Bluetooth capable DAC, and more importantly, it's got aptX HD and Bluetooth 5.0. What that should allow is pretty low latency and also very high quality. To my understanding, it still doesn't make it a truly lossless transmission system, so you are going to be degrading sound quality when using it with Bluetooth, but the good news is that aptX HD makes it about as good as you can get for a wireless or Bluetooth at least protocol. Continuing on, we've got a USB-B socket, we've got the Toslink socket and the coaxial. So your three kind of regular normal digital inputs, and as I've already mentioned, all three of them can actually handle both MQA and DSD. The maximum performance of the coaxial and the Toslink is slightly lower than the USB, but it's still really, really good for most applications. I'll put a link down below, so if you want to see specifications of exactly where the coaxial and Toslink max out, you can check with the link down below. For now though, let's continue to the outputs. We've got a pair of XLR outputs and a pair of RCA outputs. So yes, this is a balanced DAC, a fully balanced DAC. This is going to output a balanced signal from these XLRs here into a balanced headphone amp for a fully balanced system. And of course, with the companion balanced SH-8s amplifier, that makes a fully balanced setup. So it's a really nice entry point type unit at $360 to get yourself into a fully balanced setup with some really interesting features. Before I talk about the features though, and while I've got the unit in my hands, let me talk about one other thing that's here. You might notice straight away there are 3 feet on this. It's a really, really annoying design that I've seen a lot of people complain about on forums, on my YouTube community page when I announced the release of these. It's just a bad design decision in my opinion. I don't know what benefit they think they're getting out of it by doing this, but I can't see one. Now in theory, having 3 points of contact can be more stable than 4. The only problem is, if you look at the design of the back here, you've got a single power cable on this corner, and you've got potentially 2 heavy XLR leads plus a pair of RCA leads coming out of this corner. What that means, when you put it on a flat surface and you put more weight on one corner, not so good. So it's a really disappointing thing that they've only done the 3 feet. They have provided extra rubber feet in the box, so you can stick a couple on each corner, but it just begs the question, why didn't they just stick them on themselves? I really don't get that decision. There must be some rationale behind it, but I'm not sure what it is. I'm just going to cover it off right now. The exact same thing is true on the SH-8s. It also has that instability issue due to the 3 feet. So do be aware of that going into this. It's really annoying, but you do get provided extra feet. So just stick them on the second you take it out of the box and away you go. I haven't done it here, so I could show you just how bad it was. So now with that little wrinkle out of the way, let's talk about the features and functions of the SU-8s. It's got lots and lots of different features and functions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to talk about the things that I think are the most interesting, relevant, or different in the respect of people used to products like this or looking at buying a product like this. There's lots more information about some of the functions and features, such as the jitter reduction technology, or the setting at least, that's in the various DAC chips from Sabre. It's stuff that you can read about pretty easily in the manual or around the internet, so I'm not going to go into detail on that. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is how this DAC is to use and which features and functions I thought were beneficial or irrelevant to the sound quality. One of the first things I want to talk about is to get into the menu system for the SU-8s, you click on the control dial. You then rotate through the options, you click to select, you rotate through those options, and you click to select again. The one problem is there's no back button in sight on the actual device. So you have 2 choices. You either have to use the remote control even if the device is right within reach, or you've got to sit there and wait and wait and wait for the system to back out of the menu when you're done. I personally found that pretty frustrating at times, and as I said at the beginning, it's not a huge deal breaker, but I do find it a pretty clumsy system. Just one more button on there to back out of things, or an option in each menu to exit when you're done, both of those would have been great. As it stands, you've got to sit and wait for a while, which is a little bit annoying, but not a big deal because a lot of these things, once you play around initially and get it set up, you're probably not going to be using it too often anyway. The features, that is, not the DAC. Hopefully, you'll be using the DAC all the time. The other features I want to talk about are the filter settings and also the what they call sound color settings. The filter settings on the SU-8s allow you to choose how the DAC is going to handle the high frequency content that comes as a part of Delta Sigma decoding. All Delta Sigma DACs do this. Some of them give you the choice of how to do it, others just do what the manufacturer thinks is best. Interestingly, in the case of the SU-8s, the options have been much limited compared to what you see on other Sabre DACs and some AKM DACs as well. In the case of the SU-8s, we've only got 3 choices. You've got fast linear, you've got slow minimum, and then you've got minimum phase. In each case, they make subtle changes to the presentation of the sound, but they're more just a subtle adjustment in the way the DAC presents the sound. So in the case of fast linear, things are quite crisp and quite clean. In the case of slow minimum, there's a bit more sense of space in the overall presentation and things are just a bit smoother. In the case of minimum phase, it splits the difference between the two. As to which one's better, that's going to be entirely personal choice. For most of my testing, I left it on fast linear, but I like all 3 for different reasons. So it is very much a personal preference, and I happen to use fast linear because it gave me the most sense of detail and articulation, but at the cost of a little bit of lost soundstage space. The other unique sound adjustment feature on the SU-8s is its ability to give you what they're calling sound color. So this is a deliberate coloration being added to the sound based on what I think is some digital signal processing or DSP going on. I'm not entirely sure how it's being delivered. I'm also not 100% sure on what is being delivered. It's a really interesting setting that doesn't actually make as much difference as I would expect when you're talking about deliberately colouring the sound. It's done so subtly that I actually don't think it's worth bothering with. But what I think I heard across the options is you've got standard, which of course there's no coloration added. You've then got 3 levels of what they call rich, tube, and crystal. How I understood it or how I heard it, and as I said, it's very subtle and also seems to come in gradually, so it's not like you can do a quick A/B test by switching them on or off. It seems to almost fade in the difference or just smooth it in somehow. What I think is going on though is that the rich coloration is giving you a bit more bass emphasis, but very subtle, as I said before. The tube coloration is giving you a little bit of mid-range thickness or richness, perhaps is probably a better term. And then finally, the crystal option is giving a slightly more sort of edgy definition to the treble. In each case, the differences to me were pretty subtle. I'm not suggesting there's no difference. You can hear that there's something changing, but it's subtle enough that I couldn't sit here and confidently say this is exactly what's going on. So it's something that I would say I'll leave you to play with yourself if you buy the SU-8s. I don't think it's a reason that you should or should not buy the SU-8s though, because it's a very minor bit of coloration. For me, I happily left the DAC in standard mode for the entire time that I was testing it, other than when I tested out those colorations of course, but once I'd finished trying each of the colorations, I just went back to standard and was completely happy with that. And that brings us to the sound quality overall of the SU-8s. I found it to be very kind of smooth, but detailed and articulated. It's always interesting when describing the sound of a DAC. Ideally, you don't want a DAC to have too much character. You don't want it to be overly lush or overly cold or edgy or anything like that. To me, you want a DAC to be pretty transparent. That's not to say that all DACs sound the same, despite what some people might tell you. There are things within the output stage of the DAC, the way the power supply is managed, all of those things can influence the sound of the DAC. And so for me, what I'm looking for when I'm listening to a DAC is whether or not it has a sense of edginess or being overly smoothed off or muddy, any of those things that to me take it away from a neutral sound. Because what I want is for it to sound neutral, but still smooth and not at all edgy. And to me, the SU-8s absolutely nails that. I do also always like to compare the USB, coaxial and Toslink connections to see if there's any noticeable differences there. And putting aside the fact that each of those interconnects is slightly different, I think the performance of the SU-8s is comparable on all of them. The coaxial was a little bit richer and smoother than the other two, but not that far removed that I'd say any of them are not doing a good job. One thing worth noting was that I was using the very high quality Wave High Fidelity Storm BNC cable when I was testing the coaxial input for the SU-8s, and so that that may have played a part in terms of the overall qualities that I heard. In the case of the Toslink cable, I was using a Lifertech optical cable that was actually donated by Stagger Lee, one of the channel patrons, so thanks Stagger Lee for your donation, it's coming in very, very handy. In the case of the USB, I think at this point I was using the Oide Neo D+, I think it's called, USB cable, one of the ones that I covered in my recent USB comparison review. So all the cables are a little bit different, and they're always going to be different when you're using USB, coaxial, and Toslink, and so as long as things all sound acceptable and good, I don't really see there being any issues. I do occasionally find that one or other of the connections on certain DACs is noticeably inferior, but that's not the case with the SU-8s, and that's great news for us. Two other points to cover off before we wrap up on the sound quality and talk about the SH-8s is that the XLR and the RCA outputs are both essentially identical. There is a difference in volume output, and so it's slightly difficult for me to say exactly how they compare and whether they're 100% identical, but they're close enough that you can comfortably use both. The XLR outputs may have slightly better definition and separation in the sound, but it's very, very close. So do think about this as being highly usable with both XLR and RCA. The final thing to talk about is if you do have a DSD collection or you're someone that's happy to upsample your PCM into a DSD output before it hits the DAC, I did find the SU-8s to sound just a little bit better with a native DSD signal. Now when I say native DSD, my point being that it's coming out of the computer as DSD before it hits the DAC. It resulted in a slightly smoother and slightly more spacious sound overall. It's not a deal breaker where I'd say you have to use this with DSD, but it is a nice improvement if you're in a position to do some upsampling from your computer. And so with all that in mind, I'm going to do a quick comparison now with the Geshelli Labs J2 DAC before we come back around and talk about the SH-8s amp on its own, then compare it to the Geshelli Labs Erish, and then of course the two stacks against one another. So talking now about the Geshelli Labs J2 DAC, which you can see here, these two are priced pretty similarly. The J2 is a little bit cheaper at $299 US, so there's about $60 US difference. But at the same time, you are losing some features when you buy the J2. You're not getting any kind of display, you're not getting any kind of volume control or preamplification ability, you're just getting a pure DAC. There's also no Bluetooth in the J2, and of course no MQA. So it's more of a pure DAC solution compared to the very versatile SU-8s. In terms of sound quality, the two of them are almost indistinguishable when I flip back and forth. The fixed level output from the SU-8s is just a little bit higher than the J2, and so I did have to attenuate it slightly using the volume control, the preamp capabilities of the SU-8s. Once they were volume matched, I did find some very subtle differences, namely that the SU-8s is just a little bit smoother on the sound. Whether that's better or worse is going to be a preferential thing. I couldn't say that I think one is better or worse, they're just ever so slightly different. One area that the SU-8s maybe does have a slight edge though, is I think the presentation is just a little bit more spacious with a tiny bit more sense of depth in the soundstage. It's still a very close call and not a reason that I think you should separate the two based on sound quality, because unless you are A/Bing them, I think you'd have a hard time knowing which was which. And so with that in mind, it's a decision that I think you should make based purely on price and functionality. If you need some of the functions of the SU-8s or you like the look of it better, then go that way. If you prefer the cheaper price tag and all the look and simplicity of the J2, then you should go that way. You really can't go wrong with either of these two DACs. And so now, having covered off the SU-8s, let's talk about the amplification part of this stack in the SH-8s. Let's talk now about the SH-8s fully balanced headphone amp. This uses the exact same form factor as the SU-8s as you'd expect, and is all in all a very similar looking unit, except for the fact that of course it doesn't have the display and it's got a few switches instead. So on the front panel here we've got a 4-pin XLR output, so this is a balanced amplifier. We've also got a 6.3mm single-ended output and then a series of toggle switches. You've got the option for on or off, of course. You've got the XLR or RCA selection for the inputs, and then you've got the high or low gain setting. Finally, we've got the same control knob, or in this case volume knob, as on the SU-8s, except this time it does have the marker so you know where the volume's set to. I'm not a particular fan of the feel of the volume knobs or the control knob in the case of the SU-8s. They're not the nicest feeling knobs ever, but at the same time the rotation of the volume pot itself is really nice, so no issues with the volume control on this. I just don't particularly like the feel of the volume knob itself, but that's really personal. Once again, as a reminder, and in case you haven't watched the first half of this review, if you jump straight to the amplifier, this also has the silly 3 rubber feet, but again, you can stick on extra feet. You have extras provided in the box, so you can always make it a 4-foot device, or 5 if you choose to leave the other one on there that's in the middle there now. Moving to the back of the amplifier, things are once again pretty simple. We've got power supply coming in, which again would lead into some kind of switch mode power supply on the inside here. We've then got XLR inputs and RCA inputs. So very simple, it's just an amp. There's no preamplification from the SH-8s because, as I touched on before but didn't go into in enough detail probably, the SU-8s covers off on preamplification duties. So if you are running active speakers, you'd run those from the SU-8s and then run whatever other connection you're not using into the amplifier. So for example, if you're running something like my KRKs here, you'd run the XLRs out of the SU-8s into the KRKs and then probably run the single-ended RCA into the headphone amp. Of course, you can do the other way around depending on the speakers you've got. You could run the RCAs out into your active speakers and then XLR to keep the headphone setup balanced. It's going to come down to which one you're prioritizing for absolute maximum sound quality, but do keep in mind they're very close to single-ended and balanced outputs from the SU-8s, so you don't have to worry too much about getting it one way or the other. They're both going to sound pretty good. So if you are restricted by which connections your active speakers have, you're pretty well set whichever way you go. Coming back to the SH-8s, I should have mentioned at the beginning that this retails for $230 or about 300 Australian dollars. So it makes it a very affordable compact headphone amplifier. With 3 watts of power into 32 ohms, it's also a pretty powerful amplifier despite its fairly tiny size. And in fact, the SH-8s has proven to me through some testing I'm currently doing for my upcoming Susvara review that it does have the grunt to drive the Susvara effectively. I'm going to cover off the details around power requirements and what it means, whether you need higher power output amplifiers like speaker amplifiers to drive a headphone like the Susvaras. I'm going to cover that off in my review of those. But for now, I'm just going to say that whilst it's not the amplifier I would recommend for something at the level of the Susvaras, it does have enough power for normal listening. For a bit of extra detail on that, it specifically runs the Susvaras for my normal listening levels, which are somewhere in the high 70s to low 80 decibel range. It runs those comfortably in high gain at about the 11 o'clock mark on the dial. And the dial goes all the way up to around about the 4 o'clock mark. So there's still plenty of headroom, and it does a great job at driving them with good solid bass that's comparable in terms of quantity to something like the TT2. Quality is a different story, but in terms of quantity, it's got enough power for normal listening. But as I said, I'll get into that in a separate review. I just wanted to confirm that the SH-8s here has enough power for anything you are ever likely to want to drive. So now let's talk about sound quality. The quality of the sound from the SH-8s is very good. It's not a world beater, it's not going to stack up against much more expensive amplifiers, but for what you're paying, it's really solid. The sound is smooth and rich, but well detailed and well articulated and extended. There's nothing that I would say is lacking from the presentation of the SH-8s. It's not too thick or too warm, it's just a well balanced overall sound. The soundstage is decently spacious, not overly deep, which is common for amps using op amps for their output stages, particularly at this price point, but there's nothing major to complain about. In testing the overall sound quality, I tried a couple of things just to be sure that it was consistent across the board, and what I found was that the single-ended input is probably slightly less separating and detailed and resolving compared to the XLRs, but it's not a drastic drop-off. It is significant enough that I would recommend if you're buying this that you try to use it with balanced inputs, but it's not a deal breaker by any stretch. As for the outputs from the SH-8s, the balanced and single-ended outputs for the headphones are basically identical. There may be a slight improvement from the XLR output, but I don't think it's big enough to get too hung up on. It's an amplifier that I would comfortably use with either output, and that's not something that I say for all headphone amps. There are some that I've tried that have significant differences where the balanced output is significantly better, but that's not the case with the SH-8s. The outputs are slightly different, but it's not a huge gulf between them. One final thing I tested after some comments some people made to me about their experiences with the Singer SA1 that I recently reviewed was I did test to see if the high gain and low gain settings changed the sound quality at all. Now that's always a difficult comparison to make because changing the gain automatically means you have to volume match before you can actually compare the signals. That then relies on auditory memory, so it's a really inexact science. Having listened to the SH-8s in both low gain and high gain mode, I'd say that there might be a very, very slight improvement in the openness of the sound when running in high gain, but that said, it is once again a very tiny difference, and at the same time, the high gain mode leaves very little volume range, or usable volume range I should say, for normal headphones. So if you're running a headphone that's not particularly difficult to drive, and I'm talking Susvara HE6 type levels of difficult to drive, you probably don't need the high gain output mode, and in fact you'll have trouble getting enough range on the volume pot to make the most of it. In the low gain setting, the SH-8s does provide enough volume range for most headphones, but IEMs may struggle to get enough volume range above the levels of channel imbalance. So it's more of a headphone amp than it is an IEM amp, but it's quite enough to use with IEMs if you can get the right levels. So in isolation, I think the SH-8s is a really nice quality amp. I didn't particularly like my previous experience of SMSL in their SP200 amplifier. I thought that was a real disappointment. I'm glad to say though that the SH-8s completely changes that experience, and it's an amplifier that I would very comfortably use as kind of a daily driver type device. To put it into perspective, just as I did with the SU-8s, let's now talk about the SH-8s up against the Geshelli Erish. Once again, the Geshelli product is a little bit cheaper than the SMSL product, but it also trades off features. In the case of the Erish, you've only got balanced in and balanced out. You don't have the ability to run single-ended in or single-ended out. For the difference in $30 US, that may be a deal breaker if you specifically need single-ended in or out, but otherwise, it's really going to come down to the sound quality. And both of these amps, just like with the DACs, both of these amps sound very, very similar. I'd say that the SH-8s is probably just a touch crisper with the treble compared to the Erish, so the Erish on the other hand is a little bit smoother. In neither case would I say one is better than the other, they're just a little bit different. One other area that I noticed a difference was that the Erish is slightly punchier in the bottom end, but it's a very, very minor difference. Once again, just like it was with the DACs, I think I'd split these two based on the feature set more so than the sound quality, and of course the price if you're looking to save a few bucks. One interesting experience I had when listening to these was playing back Love Reign Over Me by The Who from the Quadrophenia album. When using the Mezza Empyreans, the sound of the piano in the opening of Love Reign Over Me was just more believable. It had a tonal richness from the SH-8s that the Erish couldn't match. I was all ready to write down the fact that the SH-8s was the superior amp, and then I tried the Susvara. With the Susvara, everything flipped on its head. All of a sudden, the Erish was the preferable amp in terms of the richer, more natural tonality, and the SH-8s became the one that sounded a bit artificial. What that tells me is that both amplifiers are going to have their own synergies with certain headphones, and that both are equally good depending on what you're pairing it with. I should add that neither was bad with either headphone, it was just that when I was comparing the two, I had a clear preference in each direction, depending on the voicing of the headphone. It is also worth mentioning that the Erish is just a touch underpowered for the Susvara and would run out of puff if I was trying to get the absolute most out of it, particularly in the low end. For a track like Love Reign Over Me, particularly in the opening part, there was nothing too taxing from the Erish, so I was hearing the full potential of both headphones from both amps. It was just a tonality thing with the coloration of the headphone amplifiers, albeit slight colorations, pairing up with the colorations of the headphones. If you were to take anything away from that, it's probably that the Erish is a slightly better choice with slightly drier, leaner, brighter headphones, whereas the SH-8s is probably a little bit better if you're leaning into warmth. That said, they're very subtle differences, so don't get hung up and think that you have to choose one or the other depending on your headphone. They're both going to work just fine with any headphone I can think of because they're pretty close to neutral with just some slight characteristic differences. So thinking of these as stacks again now, you've got the $590 SMSL stack and you've got the $500 Geshelli stack. In the case of the SMSL stack, you've got a lot more features and functions available to you, such as preamp capabilities from the DAC, you've got the filter changes, you've got the Bluetooth module, the sound color options. There's lots of things it can do that the Geshelli can't. Likewise with the amplifier, you've now got single-ended inputs and outputs that the Erish doesn't have. So out of the two of them, if you're looking for a full feature set, the extra $90 is going to get you that, and it also gives you what I think is a more aesthetically pleasing stack. The odd sizing of the Erish and the J2 for some people is going to be an issue, whereas the SMSL stack does sit really nicely as a unit, particularly if you install the extra feet so it doesn't rock around on its 3 rubber feet. In terms of sound quality, I don't think I can honestly separate these two stacks other than to say they're a little bit different. One is not clearly better or clearly worse than the other, they're just a slightly different sound. As a total stack, I would say that the SMSL presentation is a little bit smoother but still nicely extended. The slightly crisper sound of the SH-8s balances off the slightly smoother sound of the SU-8s. Whereas on the flip side, the Erish is slightly smoother and the J2 is slightly crisper. So they kind of cancel each other out and end up pretty comparable overall. So for me, it's going to come down once again to the question of your budget, whether you want to spend the extra $90 and or whether you're going to use the extra features that you're getting or whether the aesthetics matter to you that much. Ultimately though, to wrap this all up, I think the SMSL stack here is a really fantastic stack. It's good value, it looks good, it performs well, it's got amazing amounts of power for its footprint. I think it's just a really great option. If I'm being really honest, I don't absolutely love it, but that's going to be a personal thing. I don't find interacting with it particularly enjoyable, but at the same time, I guess I don't really find interacting with the Geshelli stack specifically more enjoyable either. I think somewhere in the mix here, the look of the SMSL stack has me expecting a slightly more refined feel as I'm interacting with it, both in terms of the menus, the switches, the way the whole device is just to touch and to adjust. And I didn't necessarily get that experience in terms of the tactile feel of it. That's not to say it's cheap or bad, it just doesn't have the feel of some of the other products that I've used in the past. And I think a lot of that comes down to the volume knobs that, as I said before, I'm not a huge fan of, but it's absolutely not a deal breaker. So that's probably the only reason why I'm not raving about the SMSL stack. I think other than the fact that I don't personally like interacting with these volume knobs, I think other than that, it's a really, really solid option. It's got every feature you could think of in terms of the DAC that most people are going to need, and it's got a really powerful, clean but smooth sounding amplifier that's not going to suck the life out of your headphones and instead will give you a rich and enjoyable articulate sound. So if you're in the market for a stack like the SMSL here, this is definitely one to look at. If you've got up to say $600, it is worth considering in that price range. So once again, I want to say thank you to Shenzhen Audio for making this review possible, allowing me to get this review out to you quickly. If you're in the market for a stack like this and this sounds like a good option for you, then do check out the link down below through to Shenzhen Audio to say thank you. There's no affiliates there, there's no kickbacks. It's just a way of saying thank you for them sending out the units so that I could share them with you. As always, if you found this review useful, please hit the like button and the subscribe button. It really helps the channel to keep sharing content like this and to get more products like the SMSL stack here. For now though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.